Welcome. My name is Lloyd Borrell. I'm your host. Today, I'm thrilled to have as my guest Dr. Peter Osborne. Dr. Osborne is a doctor of chiropractic. He's a doctor of pastoral medicine, and he's a board-certified clinical nutritionist. Dr. Osborne is on the advisory board for Functional Medicine University, and he's one of the world's leading authorities on gluten sensitivity. Dr. Peter Osborne, welcome to the EMF Health Summit.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's a great pleasure to have you on. So you're the author of the bestseller, No Grain, No Pain. Now, I'm from the generation that was told that grains were good for us. I remember this when I was a kid, being told this. And, we all had all those cereals and stuff, and we had to eat our cereals, and it was good for us and all that. So I guess where I'd like to start is just by asking you the question, what is the problem with grain-based foods today?
Well, where do we begin? That's a mouthful because, we go back in time to the late 1800s. People think that grain is somehow this human staple food that without it we could never have survived, and it's just not true. It's actually a marketing. I won't say a marketing ploy, but it's just very, very solid and good marketing done by the cereal and the grain-based industry, combined with the history as it's evolved. In 1895 was really when the first cereal processing machine was created. So we really didn't even have breakfast cereals the way that we think of them until the early 1900s when shredded wheat machines were created. And again, so a lot of this is historical. What we grow up with, we think has always been true because it's what we grow up with and it's what we've always known. So it's, a lot of times people don't realize that, grain, before it was introduced in the forms of cereal and processed grain-based items, the human nutrition was just fine. It was it was solid in a lot of different ways. What grain actually did is it made starvation a lot harder because you could grow huge crops of grain and you could feed hundreds of thousands of people without them having to hunt and gather and having potential starvation. But the double-edged sword of grain is that although it did solve mass food production problems, it also created mass chronic degenerative disease evolution in this country. A lot of people don't realize in 1943, the United States government banned the sale of processed grain. They said you can no longer sell it. And the reason why is it was killing about 8,000 people a year, which is quite a bit. 8,000 people a year were dying as a result of malnourishment from consuming processed grain products. And it was at that point in time that in the U.S. that the food fortification laws were passed, mandating that in order to sell these grain-based products, you had to add vitamin B1 and vitamin B3 and iron and other nutrients just so they wouldn't kill people. So a lot of people, they don't realize that, this grain, this cereal was actually responsible for deaths because they grew up with a different marketing message. So the cereal companies didn't say, don't eat us. They didn't say, stop eating us, we're killing people. What they said is now eat more of us because we're now even better for you. We're fortified with vitamins and minerals to make it even healthier for your daily breakfast or for your daily food. And it was that message, that marketing message that translated generations into believing that grain was somehow a necessity for humans to maintain good health. The reality is that's not true. It never has been true. The reality is that the marketing and the cartoon characters used in that marketing to indoctrinate children into making sure they were believing, like Trix Rabbit and Cocoa Puffs and the frog and Cocoa Smack Frog, all these very endearing cartoon characters that we've all grown up with. Your generation, the generation even before that, were a part of a marketing effort to make grains appear as if they were somehow a necessity for breakfast, right? And so that's part of the problem, is that people think that it's a necessity. And you have a lot of scientists that aren't really scientists that are out there saying if you don't eat grain, you're going to be malnourished in certain nutrients, which is just not true. It never has been true. The research does not support that. What happens, what they're really focused on is they're saying that the gluten-free diet is more unhealthy. It is if you're following a gluten-free diet where you're going to the store and buying boxed, packaged corn and rice-based products, not good for you, right? Not good for you at all. So the gluten-free diet is only unhealthy if a person is swapping out wheat, barley, and rye with a bunch of processed corn, oats, and rice-based products. So if you're eating whole, real foods, non-processed, there's really no risk of developing malnourishment as a result of not eating grain in the diet. So that's one of the elements behind, we grew up with this false belief. So I thought I would share at least a little bit of the history behind why that false belief pattern even exists. Beyond that, we look at modern farming today, and the practices with modern farming today is we don't have small mom and pop farms anymore. We have these huge corporate conglomerate farms where you're using genetically modified seeds, you're using high doses, double doses, in many cases, triple doses of glyphosate, which is a compound that has been shown and implicated in a number of different health issues, not only in animals, but even in humans. And we're storing these grains in big bins where they have the tendency to grow mold and produce mycotoxins. And so grain is a high mycotoxin mold-based food. And then we're telling everybody to eat more of it, right? So we have, a different way to farm it. We're telling people to eat more of this potentially dangerous and unhealthy type of grain because of the way we grow it today. And we're seeing more and more disease as a result of it. And that's not to say it's the only cause of disease, but it's certainly up there in the realm of diet-induced chronic degenerative autoimmune processes. Grain consumption is got to be top 3 in terms of what a person can do in order to improve their overall health from chronic degenerative autoimmune processes.
Yeah. So a lot of information there. And, listening to you say all that, it's the thought going through my mind is, well, just how is it that we've all sort of been led to believe that grains were good to it, and how is it that people are still eating grains, in fact? But yeah, you talked about gluten, so perhaps we could just expand on that a little bit. If you could explain, what is gluten, because it's a real buzzword at the moment. What is gluten, and why gluten is a problem in our culture?
Well, gluten is kind of the protein that gets all the credit for doing the damage. Gluten is defined botanically as it's a family of proteins found in the seeds of grass. And there are a lot of different species of grass. And there's not just one gluten. That's another misconception, is that we use the term as if it's a singular term, gluten, as opposed to glutens. And really, we should be using it as a plural term, because there are, to date, there are close to 1,000 different different forms of gluten. The one that was originally studied in the late 1940s, early 1950s as being identified as a cause of celiac disease is called alpha-gliadin. It's a type of gluten found in wheat, barley, and rye. It's not the only gluten. It's just one type. And we actually have identified many more types since then. As a matter of fact, there's a study done in Australia. Dr. Bob Anderson et al. Identified 400 new classes of gluten proteins and found that 10% of them, 40 of them, were more toxic than the originally discovered alpha-gliadin. So this is where, like lab testing, people going into the doctor say, am I gluten sensitive? And they're getting their lab testing done. They're getting alpha-gliadin testing done, right? But they're not getting gluten testing done. Gluten testing would be when we don't have a commercial lab that tests every known form of gluten. I mean, the most aggressive lab in the world today only tests for about 13 different forms of gluten. So it's quite limiting. This is why, for gluten testing, I recommend people look at genetic testing, because genetic testing allows you to understand whether or not you have the genetic propensity to react to the family of gluten proteins. So again, backing up, gluten is a family of proteins, not a singular protein. It's a family of proteins found in the seeds of grass. These proteins, their job within the seed is to protect, to preserve, and to feed the embryo, the germ of the seed, so that it can grow new grass. And a lot of people don't realize, but the plant itself, the seed itself, which is the grain, right? it's not designed to be your food. Like Mother Nature, God did not create that seed to be your food. It created it more specifically to help perpetuate its own species, right? And so we've forgotten that lesson, and that when we eat a staple food based out of grain, which is a type of food that's designed to survive digestion, because that grain, it contains not just gluten, but it also contains other proteins, other families of proteins that act as anti-digestives. Basically, some of these proteins have been shown to shut down human digestion because that seed it wants to survive your GI tract. It doesn't necessarily want to hurt you, but it wants to survive your GI tract. And part of how it does that is it tells your pancreas to be quiet, to calm down, to not secrete digestive enzymes, so that it can come out in your poop as a whole seed. And the poop acts now as a fertilizer on the ground. So like this is one of the mechanisms of the way grain has evolved to survive, so that the grasses can survive predation, predators, eating it into complete non-existence. Mm. So when we think about it just from the common sense perspective, gluten aside, understand what seeds are. They are designed to perpetuate their own species, not to perpetuate the human species. And so it's, again, some people would say, well, there's lots of seeds that we eat. We eat flaxseed, we eat chia seed. What about those? And that's true for those as well. You should never eat seed as a primary staple food in your diet. This is one of the problems with grain, is we make everything out of grain, right? We make pasta out of grain. We make bread out of grain. We make cereal out of grain. We make cereal bars out of grain. We add grain to meats as a filler, right? We do so much with grain that we're constantly being bombarded by a life force that is designed to survive predation. And so at some point, people's guts tend to break down. They can only handle so much. We can process to a certain extent some of it, but if you make it your staple food and you eat mass quantities of it day in and day out, it can create leaky gut. It can create a breakdown in your gut barrier. It can alter your microbiome and challenge your GI tract beyond what it's capable of doing for you. And when that happens, a lot of people start to develop GI symptoms, irritable bowel syndromes, inflammatory bowel disease, things like celiac disease, Crohn's, and ulcerative colitis, right? People start to develop the problems in the gut, not so much necessarily even because they are gluten sensitive, but because what they're eating is designed to survive their gut. So it's this war that's going back and forth, and their gut finally breaks down and finally loses that war when they're constantly bombarding it with highly processed grains that are designed to survive our digestion.
Yeah. So obviously we don't want to be at war, we want to be at peace. But before we go further on that, I want to bring in electromagnetic fields, if I can. Most people have what I call an aha moment with electromagnetic fields. That's what I want to just ask you first is, what provoked your interest in this subject, EMFs and health?
Well, I'm a clinician, so, I'm interested in anything that could potentially create an environment that's not healthy for somebody who's sick, who's come to me and trying to get healthy. And whether that's food or chemical exposure or radiative damage or radiative type exposure, we look at four very big triggers that are biochemical in nature: food, chemicals, infectious microorganisms, and nutrition. And chemicals, we classify an EMF in that chemical category because it's electrical chemical bombardment. And for some people, their health is not necessarily deteriorated as a result of just EMF, but their health has deteriorated, and EMF is one more thing that's out there that they're also being exposed to. And once their health is deteriorated and weak, EMFs just make it very, very hard, right, for them to ever make a recovery. And that's what I see repetitively clinically in many people, is that the EMFs themselves, they're just playing a role as one more thing that's weakening an already weakened host, an already weakened immune system. The other thing that got me really interested in EMFs originally was the fact that there's some studies that have come out that show that EMF proliferates, helps mold grow stronger. And one of the ways that there was some research done that showed that low frequency EMF, which is similar to what we find in a cell phone radiation, actually helps mold cells, budding yeast, proliferate through the process of glycolysis, which is basically, it helps them make energy better. It helps them convert their food energy into applicable energy so that they can proliferate easier. So EMFs basically help mold grow. And many of our chronically sick patients have yeast overgrowth, which is a form of mold. So you get somebody with yeast overgrowth in their small intestines, and they're being slowly bombarded by electromagnetic frequencies from their laptop sitting in their lap right by their gut, right? And it's just a potential to help proliferate that yeast in their GI tracts. And so that's really where my big interest first began, was just in discovering some of the research that some of the great scientists have put together for us in terms of EMF proliferating mold.
So you are getting patients where you are being able to identify that these EMFs are contributing, at least, perhaps not causing, but contributing to their health situation. So my question is, how clear can you be on that EMFs are playing a role? Is it you're looking at the science and you're saying, well, I think that, or are you able to do some actual testing on this?
There's no commercial available laboratory testing that says you're EMF poisoned. So I'll be very, very clear on that. When in the type of practice that I have is functional medicine. So those of your audience that don't know what functional medicine is, functional medicine is, it's the art and science of not calling your patient a liar, which is what a lot of doctors do. And what I mean by that is when a patient comes in, it's about developing a relationship and listening to the patient's history and story, doing a proper examination, and doing appropriate objective laboratory testing so that you can come to some type of definitive conclusions as to why that person might be sick, as opposed to coming to a definitive conclusion about what the symptoms the person has. Because a lot of doctors, they talk to a person and it's like, okay, you have fatigue, you have irritable bowel-like symptoms, you're having constipation and intermittent diarrhea, and your skin is inflamed and there's a rash. Okay, so here's a medicine to suppress the rash, and here's a drug to suppress your bowel problems. But we don't ever figure out why the problems exist, right? And so what functional medicine is it's the opposite of that. It's not the approach where we try to suppress the patient's symptoms. It's an approach where we try to figure out where the symptoms are coming from. So we always come in with functional medicine. We're always coming in with an open mind about what could be potentially making a person sick. And so there's no definitive lab testing for EMF, but there's good research on EMF. Now all that being said, some people will come in and report, right? And one of the best parts of science is anecdote. A lot of doctors will say, anecdote is not important. And those of you who don't know what anecdote is what happens to you as opposed to what happens in a research study where 10,000 people were studied. So like in research studies where we do double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trials, we'll take 10,000 people, we'll give 5,000 of them a drug, we'll give 5,000 of them a placebo, right? Nobody knows who has the drug and who has the placebo. That's hidden information until the study's over. And then we analyze the results at the end. That's research studies, right? But that's not anecdote. Anecdote is when we look at what happens to a person and they report their experience back, okay? So like if a person says, every time I turn on my wireless at home, I feel a little dizzy. I get more fatigued. I feel strange. Right? That's anecdote. That's that person's experience or perceived experience as it relates to their exposure to that EMF. And anecdote is very important in clinical medicine. It's very important because if you don't listen to the patient and you don't partake of what your patient's perceived experiences are, then you're missing a big part of the information that could potentially help that person get better. And as a doctor, you're also missing the potential opportunity to become educated about whether or not something is impacting a person. Does that make sense? So, yep. But so from a research perspective, there is research on EMF creating biochemical abnormalities in life forms. Most of the studies are in vitro. Some of the studies are in animals. There's no real great studies yet long-term in humans. But we have to still apply what we see in the research. If we know that EMF fields, for example, can affect calcium channels in nervous system, right? And we know that calcium channels are very critical for the release of serotonin and dopamine. And the person in front of you is saying, every time I talk on my cell phone, I get depressed, right? Or I have the symptoms of serotonin or dopamine deficiency. We have to consider that. There's research that supports it, and then there's anecdote as a person is reporting their symptoms directly that supports it. So as a functional medicine doctor, you have to be open to both of those areas, and you have to be versed in both of those areas, both the research as well as the anecdote of what's actually happening within a patient. But to date, to my knowledge, there's no commercial lab that can detect this person has EMF poisoning. Unless you've got such severe radiative poisoning, like you've been massively exposed to an electromagnetic field, or you've been massively exposed to a radiative damage, like major CT scans where you've got tons of DNA fragmented damage as a result of having, 35 CAT scans in the last 2 years. Like we can document those types of damages, but there's no lab test that can definitively say, yes, this is EMF damage from your wireless connection in your home, or from the wireless connection in your coffee shop, or from the accumulative wireless connections of the people around you.
So you're listening to your patients and you're putting two and two together. And so my question is, to what extent do you perceive that this is a growing problem? You've been doing this a certain number of years. Is this, EMF link, is it getting worse, or is it the same, or how are you seeing this?
Well, I'm going to give you an analogy to answer that question. If we look at the last 50, 60 years, okay, I'm going to use food first. Food chemicals, there have been at least 30,000 new chemicals introduced to humans in the last 60 or so years that have been approved without proper long-term safety, okay? And in that same time frame, we've seen an exponential rise in autoimmune disease. Now, some people would say, well, that's correlation, and correlation is not causation. And they're right. Correlation is not causation. But science starts with intelligent thought. And intelligent thought would say that if you're going to subject somebody to 30,000 new chemicals, that there should be some type of at least thought process as to how that could potentially create or contribute to human illness, especially when we see the exponential rise in human illness without any really other known reasons. Because the big things that we've done, the big changes that we've done in the last 60 years, most of those have come from the food supply, or things that are added to the food supply, from vaccination chemicals that are in vaccination that have been added. And if you look at just the last 30 years, we went from like 11 vaccines to 72, right, shots. And that's a lot more chemicals for somebody under the age of 2. So that's that can be a big factor that should be at the forefront of people's minds. And now we have this massive technology increase, right, where we're seeing, and look, 15 years ago, I didn't have a cell phone, right? I had a pager. And that was pretty much the case for most people. I mean, we didn't have smartphones really start getting developed until about the last 8-9 years, right? I mean, what are we on, version 10 of some of these phones? So, they haven't really become mainstays until about the last 5 years. So what we've seen is an exponential increase in people's exposure to EMF without long-term safety data studies. Most scientists, the studies on electromagnetic fields, the studies on radiation exposure are based on, the safety studies are based on, does that radiation produce enough heat within a biological life form that heat would cause a disruption in that person, right? But there are other aspects to measure beyond production of heat. Heat production, that's like saying we're only going to use one aspect of 1,000 different aspects, and we're going to only say, well, if it doesn't do that, there's no way it can cause harm. It's kind of a presumptive thing to do, especially amongst scientists. And there certainly are a lot of scientists that are out there trying to do more studies on EMF, especially the low frequency, long-term exposure. Because I think we don't have enough data to say, yeah, this is the cause of cancer. This is the cause of this disease. This is the cause of that disease. And I don't think we'll ever have that answer, to be honest with you, because I don't think it's just EMF. I think it's EMF. There's more EMF now than there has ever been. There's more chemicals in the food than there has ever been. There are more people that are going to jobs that they hate and working in environments that are soul crushing to their spirits, right? So we have lots of environmental factors that have changed in the last 50 to 60 years that it's accumulated. And all of these things, when added and combined together, are creating environments that are just not conducive to the health of people. And part of what I try to do in functional medicine, part of what functional medicine doctors try to do, is we try to ascertain, of all those different things, what are those elements that a person can do? What are the things that a person can be empowered to change that can at least move their health in the right direction? So as it relates to EMFs, common sense, you should be turning off your internet connections in the nighttime. You don't need it. You're not using it. Minimize it. Minimize your exposure. You should be turning off your cell phone at night, or at least putting it in like an airplane mode where it's not emitting that frequency. If you can hardwire your house instead of having the wireless, that's a smarter move, right? I mean, we're not going to quit using technology. That's the reality. People are not going to quit using cell phones. They're not going to quit using microwave ovens. They're not going to quit using these things that produce magnetic fields or radiative fields. And to be honest with you, there's a lot of things that create magnetic fields. Crickets create a magnetic field. So again, we don't know in the long term how aggressive or how severe those things impact people, but we do know certain people are more sensitive to it than others, right? And this is where the problem is that a lot of doctors just say, it's not heating you up, therefore it's not creating damage, and they're not taking into account biochemical individuality. There are certain people that are ultra sensitive to EMF. There are some people that can tolerate a lot more. We're all unique and different in our own rights, just like some people are naturally gifted and they can run really fast. Some people are horrible at running fast, but they can run long distances slow, right? Some people can think very quickly and very sharply, whereas some people don't think quite as quickly, but they have other talents or other gifts. Maybe they're very strong, right? So we have different unique gifts and abilities and different unique lacks of gifts, or we could say disadvantages. And EMF susceptibility is definitely one of those that I can say honestly, within practice, we've seen people struggle with.
Great information there, Dr. Peter, and some really good tips as well. So I want to ask you also, while I've got you on, about parasites, because I know this is another of your specialities. Can we just address that a little bit? So you're talking, there's all these factors, and clearly parasites are another one. So, what are parasites, and how big a factor is this, and, where are we going? Is it a growing problem again?
Kind of, if you talk to most docs, they'll say if you're not in a third world country, you don't have to worry about parasites. Parasites, eggs and worms, right? Basically, for most of the part, the parasites are worms. Some are amoebas, single cell microorganisms. As a general rule of thumb, parasite means that something is inside of you, living off of you, taking from you, but not giving to you, right? So stealing resources from you and potentially creating chemical byproducts that can be inflammatory or damaging to you. So by definition, a parasite is a thief, right? It's somebody that or something that comes into your body. And people are exposed to parasites all the time through food, through the water. Is it a bigger problem today than it ever was? No, it's just becoming more recognized. It never really went away. Doctors, with the advent of antibiotics and with the advent of plumbing and central water supplies, where people weren't being as much exposed to parasites through proper cooking of food. We do have a nice history of learning. If you eat raw fish, you expose yourself to parasites. If you eat undercooked pork, you expose yourself more aggressively to parasites. So we've learned those things through our history. And so we've seen a reduction in the capacity for people to have parasites based on hygiene practices and other things. But at the same time, the problem never really went away. It just simply was dismissed or swept under the rug. Parasites are still a problem. I think they've been a problem for many people. And what I see is that the people that have a tendency to develop parasites are the ones that either are immunosuppressed, meaning they don't have a strong enough immune system to defend themselves from the exposure to parasites that we all get, because we all get exposure to parasites. People that are taking medications that suppress stomach acid. So people with heartburn, typically they're taking, the Rolaids or the Tums or the Prilosec or the Zantac or the Tagamet or the Nexium, right? The antacid medications. Stomach acid helps kill bacteria and it helps kill parasites before they can colonize your lower GI tract. So when you suppress your stomach acid, you increase your risk of developing infection. So that's that medicine's on the rise, right? Lots of people are using those types of medicines and here's how we could tie that into gluten very easily, because many people have what they perceive to be reflux or heartburn as a result of being gluten sensitive. And then they start taking the medications and they're still eating the gluten. So they've never really fixed why the problem was there. They're still eating the gluten, but now they're suppressing stomach acid. The gluten is basically, over time, the gluten causes immune suppression. The stomach acid reduction causes immune suppression. They're still eating. They're exposed to parasites. Now they don't have the immune system to help them deal with that exposure. So the parasite basically is able to grow and proliferate in their intestines and continue to steal. And parasites steal your nutrients. They steal your B vitamins. They steal iron. And this can cause subsequent further deterioration. And so then a person ends up having illness for multiple different reasons. You see what I'm saying? So now you add EMF to that, right? And they're already compromised and they just continue to get sicker. And they're just at a huge disadvantage for recovering because, again, most doctors don't look at a person as a whole. They look at a person through these kind of mini blinders. And the GI doctors will say, I can only look at your GI tract, and we're going to look in your GI tract, and we're going to look for parasites, but if we don't find them, we're going to dismiss them. Or we're going to look for celiac disease, but if we don't find it, we're going to dismiss gluten sensitivity. And then if the patient doesn't get better and they're still struggling, the doctor says, oh, it's probably because you're depressed. Go see the psychiatrist. And then they get put on the antidepressant medication, right? And they get put on things like SSRIs and Mayo inhibitors. And, they just kind of get shuffled from one doctor to the next. Not one of those doctors actually looking at the person as a whole. And everybody just looks at them through an individual organ, through an individual disease process, and just everybody's writing the next script without actually trying to ascertain why the person's sick. So, parasites can play a role. I see parasites, and I venture to say, and don't quote me on this because this is not an exact, but probably 15-20% of the time when I run testing, we'll see somebody come back with positive parasites, and there are a number of different species, a number of different types of parasites, but we do see it quite commonly.
So that's what I was going to ask you is, how do we determine if we've got a parasite problem and what do we do about it?
There are a number of different ways to try to determine it. Parasites generally, one of the better ways to detect a parasite is to look at your poop when you poop. A lot of people are kind of embarrassed about the topic of poop, right? They're like, shy away from it, but it's poop. We all do it. We all have it. We don't need to be embarrassed about it, but look in the toilet. If you're seeing blood, if you're seeing what appears to be eggs or worms in your stool, that certainly that visual confirmation can sometimes be all that's necessary. Sometimes we do microscopic. So having your doctor run a microscopic evaluation of your stool, and some doctors will do like a fecal stool sample where they'll have you collect your poop in a cup and they'll analyze it. Oftentimes the single samples are not enough because you could have a poop that's parasite free and then the next poop isn't parasite free. Parasites typically, there are stages. There are cyst stages, there are egg stages, there are adult stages, and so sometimes when you're pooping, you might not see those big worms coming out, but other times you might. So doing multiple day samples can sometimes be a more accurate way. If you talk with your doctor about that, I'm certain, if the doc's got common sense and really wants to investigate this, they'll be able to help you with something like that. So microscopic analysis of multiple day samples of stool can oftentimes be a good detection for identifying parasites.
And to treat it, because I've had some experience with this, and I use the Dr. Hulda Clark protocol, which worked really good for me. But so what do you recommend?
Yeah, the Hulda Clark protocol is great. She was one of the big experts in parasites, and she had a great book. I think that the Cure for All Diseases or the End of All Disease. Don't quote me on the name, but I've read her book, and it was a good book. There are a lot of different herbals, botanicals that are effective. Black walnut hull It can be effective as a pill or as a tincture. Parasites don't tend to like that very well. It tends to want to run them away. I love doing vitamin C flushes as part of the beginning stage of the protocol. Vitamin C flush is where you take 6 grams of vitamin C mixed in 3 ounces of water every 15 minutes on an empty stomach until you have diarrhea. And it creates a flushing response. And vitamin C is a very potent immune system stimulator. So it can help activate your immune cells in your gut so they can fight better, so they can fight the enemy better. So not only can you get a flushing response, and oftentimes you can flush a lot of parasite out when you do a flush, but you also boost your immune system's capacity to fight with the vitamin C. So it kind of is a 1-2 punch in that regard. And for some people with parasites, you can do vitamin C flushes once a week. And flushing out the gut using things like black walnut, berberine it can have anti-parasitic properties, uva ursi. There are a number of different botanicals and herbs that can be used that can also be effective.
So in terms of, I'd like to move on to solutions more generally now. And so are we saying no grains at all here? In terms of nutrition?
Well, yes and no. I don't think we can make that claim. Look, the reality is, although cereal and processed grains have only been around since the late 1800s, we can go back 2,000 to 5,000 years and see archaeological dig sites where grain was used in farming agricultural civilizations. We do see evidence that where grain was used, there's evidence of osteoporosis and evidence of celiac disease. It goes back as far back as 2000 BC, where we have kind of the first known writings on celiac disease. That being said, I think the bigger question is, we see so many people going gluten-free today, going grain-free today because they feel bad. And when they go grain-free, they feel better. So I think the fundamental question that we have to ask as scientists, and I say as scientists because I don't think we can draw any definitive conclusion at this point. There's just not enough evidence one way or the other. My experience as a clinician is that grain-free for people with chronic autoimmune disease, they need to be grain-free, period. Because with chronic autoimmune disease, the grain tends to stimulate the immune system into that process perpetuating. But does that mean that the whole world needs to be grain-free? I don't think we can come to that conclusion, even though I'm known for being the guy who's going to take people grain-free. I wrote No Grain, No Pain. Honestly, I like to test people. I don't like to guess. Everybody's different. Again, going back to the number one factor in all of this is everyone is different, and not everyone's diet is the right diet for everyone else, right? There's a phrase, and it's not my phrase. The famous Nobel Prize winning biochemist Roger Williams wrote a book in the 50s called Biochemical Individuality, meaning everybody's different. Yeah. And, we have all these labs that a lot of doctors order that are measuring ranges of different chemicals and parameters in the bloodstream. And when I read this book in undergraduate school. For me, it was really a life changer because it made me think of what normal really is. When we say this is the normal range, normal based on who? Because the study that you did to calculate those ranges, low and high, I was not included in that data. So how can you put me in the data with these other people? You can say that I should fall somewhere within that realm, but how is that my norm? 100, and especially when we take those ranges and we create those ranges in science, we typically throw out the top and the bottom 2.5% to 5% of data. We call that outlying data, and we throw it away. So the people that are really outliers, we throw their data away and we don't even use it to calculate the norms. So going back to your question, should everybody be gluten sensitive or should everybody be gluten free? Test, because some people are gluten sensitive and some people are not, right? So the number one thing that we can do is isolate and identify what our unique biochemistry is and what our uniqueness is, our biochemical individuality. So to answer the question of whether or not a person should be gluten free, I do genetic testing to discern whether or not they have the genes that are going to predispose them to creating an inflammatory response when they get exposure to gluten. And if they have those genes, then we justify diet change. If they don't have those genes, we may still be grain-free for different reasons. It has nothing to do with gluten. Meaning that I test for gluten sensitivity because I want to know whether I need to change their diet for the rest of their life. But the person could be reacting to grain for a different reason, right? Going back to what are some of the factors and parameters that are found in grain that are also linked to chronic degenerative autoimmune processes. One of them is glyphosate. So for some people that aren't gluten sensitive, for them, it might just be organic, right? Or organic, sprouted, fermented. And they may be able to tolerate that just fine. They may not have a gluten sensitivity. They may just be reactive to the pesticide. For some people, it's about the mold and the mycotoxins within the grain. So for them, avoiding it while they're sick allows them to have a better recovery, because mold and mycotoxins cause immunosuppression and can keep a person sick. For some people, the other things in the grain, one of the things about grain is its high level of omega-6 fatty acids. So a lot of people that are using grain as a staple food, they have all this omega-6 fatty acid coming in, and they have no counterbalance effect to that. Omega-6 is a pro-inflammatory fat. Now, to be clear, inflammation is not bad.
Yeah.
But if you have too much inflammation, if you have too much fat that supports and promotes that inflammation, it makes it harder to heal. So for some people, eating grain as a staple food causes a skewance in their omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio that promotes inflammation. And if they're already inflamed because of other diet and lifestyle choices that they've been making, eating grain can pose a problem in their recovery. So it depends on the person. It depends on what they're reactive to. It depends on where their diet is. Again, for me, I'm a big tester. Test, don't guess, because everybody's different. You can test for gluten sensitivity. You can test for nutritional deficiencies. You can test for food allergies and food responses. You can test omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid ratios. You can test vitamin and mineral deficiencies. You can test for parasites. You can test for yeast overgrowth. You can test the microbiome. You can test all of these things that we know play a major contributing role to chronic illness, so that we don't have to just say everybody gets the same protocol regardless of who they are because we're guessing about it. I think that's, fundamentally a person that's out there listening to this, if you don't have a doctor, like a good functional medicine doctor that you can trust or that you can go to, you're doing it alone, and you're struggling to figure it out, find a good functional medicine doctor, because you can get the right testing, and I've seen patients that said, I've been struggling 10 or 15 or 20 years. I'm like, why were you struggling? Because I couldn't trust my other doctor. They wouldn't do it. And I couldn't find a doctor who would do this kind of thing. Look, functional medicine is becoming more and more popular because more and more people are hearing about it. Now, that being said, still we have more sick people than we have enough functional medicine doctors to care for. But I would just encourage your audience, if you're struggling, if you've tried it yourself and you're still struggling, you've got to find a qualified functional medicine doctor to help guide you, because you could shave years off of your illness if you have the right guidance.
Yeah. So there's no black and white. There's no one way no one solution. And as you say, test, not guess. I'd like to ask you about, nutrition in terms of making us more resilient to EMFs. Absolutely.
Well, what is EMF? It's radiation. As in a nutshell, it's radiation, right? It's light waves at different frequencies that can create a bioelectrical, chemical, physical effect. And if we look at what we know about big radiation, big doses of radiation, the studies that have been done, for example, on sunburns, which is sunshine, UV is a form of radiation too, right? X-rays, a form of radiation. Getting up in an airplane, you're being exposed to more radiation, right? There's all these different areas where we can have greater degrees of exposure to radiation. So what can we do to protect ourselves nutritionally to optimize our body's ability to combat radiative damage? Okay, the best thing that you can do is make sure that your antioxidant function is strong, right? There are a couple different antioxidant pathways. One is called NRF2. There's superoxide dismutase is another type of antioxidant pathway. Glutathione is an antioxidant pathway. These are pathways, if we optimize our body's capacity for these pathways to work, these pathways are the pathways that protect us from this damage. We've actually done studies in humans and in animals where animals and humans are more susceptible to sunburn when they're eating junk food, right? No, think about it. I mean, when they're eating junk food, they burn easier. And when they're not eating junk food and they're eating foods that are rich in proanthocyanidins and other forms of plant chemicals that protect from radiative damage, they don't burn as easy. Okay? So part of how we learned this was original studies that were actually done on the space station in mice, where we were exposing mice to solar radiation. And we exposed two different groups of mice. We took one group of mice and we gave them just a basic sugar water. And we found that they developed cancer when being exposed to the solar radiation. And the group that we fed blueberries and strawberries to didn't develop cancer. So ultimately, translated, think of how the seasons protect us from, I'm using solar radiation here as the example. In the summertime, what's available to eat? We got lots of fruit with the bright, vivid colors. We get cherries and blueberries and raspberries and blackberries, dewberries. And the dark pigments of these fruits are what protect them from shriveling up in the sun, right? How do they survive on a bush when it's 100 degrees outside? Those pigments are photoprotective. And if we eat them, we actually get that photoprotection internally for ourselves. So one of the best ways to optimize nutrition against radiative effects, whether it's an EMF, right, from a cell phone, or whether it's a sunburn, right, is to eat food that is rich in plant-based antioxidants. So, when you see vivid colors, the purples, the reds, the blues, those are the dark colors, the rich dark colors. As a general rule of thumb, you're going to find lots of antioxidant power in those that can give you protective abilities. Now, if you're talking about supplementation, what can you do from a supplemental perspective? Again, I go back to testing. And I test people all the time. We measure their vitamin A, their vitamin D, their vitamin E. These are antioxidants. Their selenium levels, their vitamin C level, their zinc, their copper. These are all antioxidants. They all help your antioxidant systems function. If you're deficient in these essential nutrients, your antioxidant systems are not going to function as well. So you can actually test them and then target supplement what you need, as opposed to going to the health food store and buying, 20 bottles of stuff because, you look at all the different products that are available out there. They are all helpful in some way. The question is whether or not they're helpful for you as a unique person, right? Do you need to be taking 20 bottles, or could you suffice with just 2 because your diet and your nutrition takes care of the rest? So diet and nutrition are primary. We have to eat good food. There's what I call the cardinal rule of nutrition. You can't get healthy eating food that's not healthy, right? And the litmus test is you ask yourself the question, look, if I'm holding a candy bar, I ask myself, is this healthy or not healthy? Well, if the answer is not healthy, put it down. It's not serving you. It's not taking care of your temple. It's destroying your temple. And so, you've got to be honest with yourself first. Eat food that's healthy. Eat real food by being honest with yourself. And that will give you a lot of protection, because the reality is there's so much that nature has created that's for us, that if we eat, we can take advantage of. And then secondarily, we can do targeted supplementation if we do the right kinds of tests to ascertain what it is that we need. Lots of people use turmeric. Lots of people use ginger. Lots of people use chlorophyll. Lots of people use different types of algae. And lots of people use activated charcoal as a binding agent to remove toxins. And lots of people use multivitamins and high-dose vitamin C and high-dose nutrients. But again, it always is going to boil down to what is it that the person actually needs, combined with what is the lifestyle of the person and their risk of exposures based on their lifestyle. For example, if you are working in an internet tech industry, so every day you go to work and it's all about tech, and everybody's got extra EMF all around them, there may be some things that you want to do to protect yourself a little bit more from what you're being exposed to. In essence, in this case, one of the things I would advise is high doses of vitamin C, 5 to 10 grams of vitamin C on a daily basis, whether you're deficient in it or not, because you're subjecting yourself to something on a daily basis that's going to burn through more of your vitamin C and burn through more of your antioxidant capacity to protect yourself. So you have to consider what you're doing every day too. If you're a metal worker and you're in a metal shop every day working with metals, filing down metals where metal dust is floating in the air, right? Then you want to take extra nutritional support that helps your body chelate heavy metals better. If you're working in an environment where you're a lifeguard and you're outside every day and exposed to solar radiation on a daily basis, you certainly want to take advantage of the plant family of antioxidants called proanthocyanins, because these are going to give you great protection from that extra radiation that you're getting on a regular basis. If you have exposures that you can control, in essence, if you're putting yourself at risk in a needless way, like you're exposing yourself to environmental factors that you don't need to expose yourself to and that you could limit the exposure, then take intelligent action to do so. For example, if you're drinking the city's municipal water right out of the tap, right, and that water's got fluoride and chlorine and other things in it, then protect yourself by putting a filter on that water, right? So there are certain things that we can do overall to protect our bodies from what we do every day based on what we do. And everybody, what they do is different, right? So think about what it is that you're doing on a daily basis and how it is that you can minimize your risk, minimize your exposure, eat better to offer more protection to what it is that you do, and potentially supplement accordingly.
Yeah. Well, just so much information there you've shown. The time's really flown by. We're coming to the end. And it really does sound like, when I'm listening to it, it's common sense. A lot of it is just like, well, if you're doing this job, then you've got these exposures, then you need to do this. And it's common sense. And at the same time, it's probably not all that obvious to everybody what you should be doing, hence the reason to go see a functional medicine doctor. So I just want to ask you if you have any last comments or observations before we close today.
I would just simply say, any of you that are listening that are struggling, you're already doing the right thing by participating in a summit like this one. I mean, this is how you begin your journey of recovery, is you get educated, right? Education is the key foundation. God gave us all a brain, and it's whether or not we choose or we don't choose to use it. But educate yourself first. And then when you're educated, when you at least have a premise of education or backdrop, you then can ask better questions. Right? You can ask better questions, smarter questions, get better answers, get better outcomes. So starting with an education, very important. And then secondary to that, continue your process of education by connecting with a mentor. And I like mentors in my own life. I've got mentors myself. Even at the level of education that I'm at, I still have mentors. I still have people that I call on when I have, tougher challenges or tougher questions. And that's what, for a person who's not trained as a doctor, that's what your doctor's supposed to be. So again, I would just say find somebody that you can ask smarter questions to, who's willing to listen to you. And there are doctors that are out there that are like this. That just takes a little bit of elbow grease, a little bit of work to find the person that you feel comfortable with and the person that you trust.
Dr. Peter, it's been fascinating talking to you today and exploring your work and its relevance, how you made it relevant to this EMF question. So thank you. Thank you so much for being part of the EMF Health Summit.
Well, you're welcome, Lloyd, and thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
For all of you who've joined us today, thanks for being part of this movement. Stay tuned for our next session. My name is Lloyd Borrell. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.